there's an entire narrative on the left, which is essentially that the civil rights movement failed, that not much has gotten better in the USA. And I think that a lot of people, like myself and Coleman, kind of started out writing about civil rights activism, as well as our normal major or graduate school fields or whatever, almost naively. Just the idea was, well, that can't be accurate. These people must be misled. So let's tell them the truth. That's so insane. In reality, when you engage these people and you meet them at conferences and so on, you realize pretty soon that a lot of them know that the USA is not in worse shape today than it was in 1955, but that this is the justification needed for a whole bunch of programs that still exist today, like large boost affirmative action. So, I mean, I and many others have kind of stumbled on this political minefield that's sustained by lying. And every so often you see someone who points this out, like Roland Fryer, just get absolutely torpedoed, where you'll see a piece of data come to light. Like he said, not only what I said, there are 12 unarmed black men shot by cops every year, but also if you break out all males or indeed all citizens, and you just look at people who are stopped by the cops, whites are, I think he said 27.5% more likely to be shot. There's no BLM movement out there protesting for them. There are a lot of broke white guys as well, without being crude. So it was this fascinating finding. It was really a positive finding. The cops need to go a little easier on working class white men, but overall, there's no statistically significant, we would say, discrimination against anyone. It's a good job by these multicultural forces. They meet some tough guys out there. But, that's not how it was presented. I mean, he was accused of having falsified data. His lab was shut based on sexual harassment charges that suddenly popped up from nowhere. I don't mean to mock if that did happen exactly as described and would have been brought to light anyway, but it seems kind of questionable given the circumstances. His accuser was Claudine Gay. The plagiarist president.
I've talked about this. I love, and a lot of others have. It's been interesting. It's like, a recent show I saw someone saying Claudine Gay is starting to feel like one of the bad guys that pops up at the end of Scooby-Doo movies. It was Claudine Gay all along.
Yeah, well, I think it kind of was what Claudine Gay represents. So, I mean, I think that there's a movement that is based around a narrative of what are basically falsehoods that exists to kind of secure revenues. Like, I don't think it's particularly innocent anymore. I mean, you could go through the groups. Like, I mean, when I mentioned BLM GNF, that's one of about 130 organized Black Lives Matter groups. And like the total amount of money given by corporate America to Black Lives Matter was $11.6 billion. And that's an article from The Economist. That's July 2021, I believe, as mainstream as it gets. Just Google BLM gets 11.6 billion. But I mean,
billion with a B. Just I want to make sure I heard billion with a B.
Yeah, billion. Yeah, BLM GNF alone got, I think it was 180 million. Like when we were tracking these gifts to these trans groups, and we were tracking gifts in the 6 to 7 figures only. Yeah, these people got a lot of money. And I mean, Al Sharpton, he's kind of a little player these days. No hate for the Reverend. But I mean, the National Action Network never went anywhere. That's probably 50 to 80 million a year. Whatever Jesse used to be, Rainbow Coalition, that's now Our Push. That again, that's a mainstream civil rights group these days. And you go on down the line. I mean, you've got similar organizations for Muslim Americans. I mean, I mentioned working for a large gay rights group before it moved down the trans path. I mean, they have a 9-story building in D.C. That's got to be worth tens of millions just in and of itself outside of fundraising kit year by year. I mean, the SPLC has a well-invested endowment of 470 million last I looked, probably about 600 million now. So there's a massive body of entities that has an actual vested interest that's at Fortune 1000 corporate levels in certain policy positions being maintained. That's not some sort of right-wing game. If I were the senior vice president of diversity at Sony, I mean, I would have a pretty significant interest in this myself. Although, as I understand, that's a Japanese company. I doubt they have one. But just it is what it is. The broader point that I was going to make here, though, is I think things like the police shooting storyline are just little offshoots. They're sort of octopus tentacles from a deeper narrative, which is the kind of post-Marxist narrative that we've talked about, which is that every gap in performance between people is due to prejudice. And this leads to almost every inherently nonsensical position that we see today. From why is there so much insistence on the gender pay gap, now that we know that it vanishes when you adjust for the jobs people prefer to do, to much more, in my opinion, serious things, I mean, why is there the constant focus in business on equity across every profession? The baseline idea is that any gap that you see has to be due to prejudice. I'll get to the point there. That is an incredibly false idea, but it's incredibly pervasive in business and academia, really every field I've been in. It's just wildly wrong. So that probably is the big thing you need to cut out when you ask that question.
So I'm curious if what we're dealing with this sort of equity thing, right? This sense of, oh, if I see a disparity, it means there's a problem. If it's really this very deep, like, zero sum bias we have that's like goes back to the pre-industrial human life, where if you have more berries in your stack, you took them from a tree that only has so many, and that means you must have taken them from the rest of us, and so you're bad because you're hoarding the fixed number of berries. And it's that, I mean, it does feel like that zero sum intuition which modern society solved is at the root of a lot of this stuff, at the root of like this, the communist sense of exploitation and this like equity thing. Like, well, if you're doing better, that means I must be doing worse. I mean, is that how you think about it? Or how do you think about the like again, trying to be as charitable as possible, like what drives belief in things that we can disprove pretty easily when it comes to these equity claims?
That's an interesting question. I mean, so the conflict with kind of core human nature might explain reluctance to accept capitalism and so on in the first place. So for a very long time now, I don't actually really, as someone who occasionally hunts, I don't know if I totally agree with that analogy, even for primitive tribesmen. I mean, like if someone else kills an elk, that doesn't mean there's one less elk for you to kill. I mean, it means you have to walk a little further, or it might mean there are more elk for you to kill. The elk herd is in the area. You should, instead of feeling jealousy, take advantage of this opportunity. Learn to track better or something. But I mean, nonetheless, I understand what you're saying. And I think that certainly in the past, there was a more fixed level of wealth, let's say. And for a lot of history, you got wealth by taking it from other people. So, I mean,
Plunder.
yeah, plunder, reaving. Yeah, if you look at like the Romans versus the Persians and so on historically, there'd be a fairly concentrated amount of gold in one borderland area. And the way you would get more gold for your family is that you'd lead your horsemen in a successful raid against the other side's horsemen. And you'd get in through their line of defense enough to raid one wealthy peasant's farmhouse. And you'd grab a bag that had 5 pounds of gold, and you'd laugh gleefully, and you'd ride back to your lands with like a daughter over your shoulders and waving your swords. And this was like classical historical barbarism. It's what people actually just did. I mean, they'd break the border, raid each other. I mean, you steal more often in terms of like the whites versus the natives in America. You'd steal cattle, sheep, horses. So I think the basic idea that you could make money without taking it from people or having other people grow it from the ground for you did strike a lot of people as amazing. And historically, there's always been a tone of what I'd call like peasant resentment against people that could do this, like the Jewish bankers are stealing from us. And what that doesn't recognize is that the Jewish bankers are providing a service that dramatically improves the community. If money is not available to be lent that allows the development of farmland during the off season or something like that, that just doesn't happen. You paying back an additional 5%, mostly in barter, is a pretty small price to pay for that. But that's always been viewed as a sort of dark magic, like they're conjuring money from nowhere. They're lying. They're unnatural. They're violating the natural way of things. Does that have a lot to do with what we're seeing today? Maybe. It's an interesting hypothesis. I wonder if there's a way to test it. To me, the more key point is just that the equity idea is wrong. I mean, and to me, all of quote unquote wokeness comes down to these three prongs. Like prong one, I said this for NRO in a pretty lengthy piece actually, but prong one is all gaps between people are due to discrimination. The only other option is something totally unacceptable, like genetic inferiority. Two, these gaps thus give proof of discrimination within our society. We don't need any other proof. And three, the solution is equity, which is proportional representation, regardless of performance. What we actually find is that for a bunch of reasons, including genetic reasons, if you're looking at why men and women do different things, or why Samoans do well in the NFL or something like that, probably, different groups of people perform at radically different levels at different times. And often the reasons for this are totally uncontroversial. I mean, when I first looked at Black, white, and Latino personal incomes, One of the things that struck me was that you could close a third of the difference in most states, sometimes more than that, just by looking at median or modal age. So, I mean, the most common, I say this a lot, it's not a particularly brilliant point, but it's one that's just ignored all the time. The most common age for a white American right now, 58. Most common age for a black American's modal average, perfectly fair description of it, is 27. The most common age for Hispanic Americans, 11. I mean, that's a younger, much more immigrant-based community right now, large, traditionally Catholic families, a lot of kids. So when you say, well, there's a high crime rate in these immigrant communities, you'd have to adjust for age. Teenage men are the historical warriors. They're more likely to commit crimes. But also when you say, well, they have less savings and whites are indeed blacks, what a bunch of bums, you have to adjust for age. There's no practical way to expect an 18-year-old, much less an 11-year-old, to have much in the bank, unless you're talking about a piggy bank. So, I mean, all this has to be done every time you look at gaps between groups to make any sort of point, and no one ever does it outside of a few obscure academic papers on the right wing of things. So that's my main problem with the equity narrative and with the disparities equal discrimination narrative. It is probably founded in deep human psychological realities, but in the here and now, it's also just wrong. So if I were going to cut out one belief that a lot of people have that's very damaging, it would be that one, I think.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.